Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com, and this is anti-war news for Wednesday, November 9th, 2022. First story at the top of antiwar.com is some good news for a change. The U.S. and Russia have agreed to hold nuclear arms control talks. So the State Department said on Tuesday that the U.S. and Russia have agreed to hold talks on the new START nuclear arms control treaty for the first time since the February 24th invasion of Ukraine. State Department spokesman Ned Price said that a meeting of the Bilateral Consultative Commission, the BCC, which is an implementation body established by the New START, is expected to be held in the near future. So the talks will likely be focused on resuming inspections under New START that have been paused since March 2020 due to COVID 19. And the last time that a BCC meeting was held was over a year ago in October 2021. So the New START treaty is actually it's the last nuclear arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia. It's the last one left. A lot have crumbled over the years. The Trump administration withdrew from the INF treaty, which prohibited the development of short and medium range ballistic missiles. And they also pulled out of Open Skies, which was a mutual surveillance treaty. Um, Not exactly nuclear arms control, but arms control in the sense that it allowed unarmed flights over each other's territory. Russia could fly surveillance over the US and vice versa. It's considered kind of outdated now with satellite imagery and everything, but still, it's like kind of a trust building treaty. Um, But anyway, with this new START talks, Price did not specify when or where the talks will be held, but his comments came after Kommersant, which is a Russian newspaper, reported that the US and Russia agreed to hold these talks. They said it was going to be in the coming weeks, likely in an unnamed Middle Eastern country. Traditionally, these types of negotiations are held in Geneva, but Russia no longer considers Switzerland to be neutral as they have sanctioned Russia. They've joined in on some of the sanctions against Russia. I don't think all of them, but um, some of them at least. So, one of Biden's first, when it comes to the new START, it right now it's due to expire in 2026. It limits the deployment of warheads, missiles, and bombers, and it comes with an inspection regime. Although, like I said, the inspections haven't been happening for quite a while now. But one of Biden's first moves, actually, because when Biden first came into office in January 2021, it looked like the Trump administration was going to let New START expire. They were um, just kind of sitting on it. They were in negotiations with Russia, but kind of making all these demands that weren't realistic. They wanted China to be involved, but China has nowhere near the number of nuclear weapons as the U.S. and Russia, so they had no motivation to be involved. Um, so Biden comes in January, what, 20th of 2021, and the treaty was set to expire in February of that year. So one of the first things Biden did, one of the first foreign policy moves he made was got on the phone with Putin and agreed to extend this treaty. So very naively, I thought this was a good sign of things to come between the US and Russia, but then it became pretty clear rather quickly that Biden was going to be very hawkish on Russia, but at least he had the sense to extend this treaty. And the US and Russia were engaged in arms control negotiations on replacing New START before the invasion. But the US cut off that dialogue after Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, throughout the war, Russian officials have said that they're interested in arms control negotiations. I mean, since the beginning of the current war in Ukraine, but the Biden administration has shown little interest until recently. It wasn't until the very end of August that they started saying they were open to new START talks. And again, these aren't talks on, on replacing New START. These aren't talks on make creating a new nuclear arms control treaty. These are just talks on resuming the implementation of New START. But it's the first step, I think. I mean, I don't know. Sometimes you just gotta uh, try to be positive about this news when it's usually so bad. But I think overall this is a good sign. So hopefully there's more arms control that comes on top of this. All right, the next one here, more related to talks here. So Zelensky, it looks like he has changed his position somewhat. He says that he's open to talks with Putin, but he maintains maximalist demands. So Zelensky, he said this late Monday night. I didn't see it until Tuesday, but he said that he's open to talks with Russia, but only under conditions that are non-starters for negotiations with Moscow. His conditions include Russia withdrawing from the territory it has captured in Ukraine. Now, remember, Russia has said it's annexed these regions, so I don't think they're just going to pull out. He also wants Russia to pay compensation for war damages and the prosecution of alleged Russian war crimes. So he wants this all before negotiations can even start. So it's not realistic. But missing from his demands was his previous stance that talks could only happen if Putin was no longer the president of Russia. Remember, he signed a decree ruling out talks with Russia as long as Putin is president. But there's been these media reports that said the US was privately encouraging Ukraine to drop this position for public relations purposes. Sources told Politico on Tuesday that Zelensky changed his position as a result of this of being nudged by the US. And the effort included in-person talks between Zelensky and US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan that took place in Kiev last week. Now, a senior Biden administration official told Politico that even though they were pushing Zelensky to drop this position, they don't actually want peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, at least at this point. This official said, quote, "That doesn't mean they need to go to the negotiating table right now. We don't even think right now is the right time based on what Russia is doing," end quote. So the U.S. seemed like they were concerned that it looked bad that Ukraine was taking such a firm stance against negotiations, while Russian officials, including Putin, continued to say that they're open to talks. But the U.S. is expecting the war to last for years, and they're setting up and they're making preparations reflecting that. We'll get more into this in another story, but they're setting up a new command to oversee arming Ukraine, and it's going to be opened in 2023. So Zelensky, I don't know if this really means much. That he has kind of changed his position here after pressure by the U.S. because see his officials saying that they don't actually expect peace talks to happen. But it is a change. I don't know. I've seen some people try to, get, look at this in a positive light, but it's tough to do so when you see them basically saying, because the reports about the U.S. pushing Zelensky to change his position said that the purpose is not to encourage diplomacy. It's just to ease concerns of other countries, such as European countries that are really feeling the impact of the war and the sanctions against Russia, the economic impact, and they're worried that they don't know if they want to be supporting this war for years and years. Um, Ted Snyder has a great viewpoint actually about this, and how he puts it is he calls it a sliver of hope, and a few other signs here that are slivers of hope when it comes to negotiations. I think that's a good way to put it because for a minute there, it seemed like if you even mentioned the word diplomacy, you're jumped on. Okay, so the next one, a three-star general to lead the new U.S. command overseeing arming Ukraine. So, Stars and Stripes reported on Tuesday that a three-star general is going to lead this new command that the U.S. military is going to establish in Germany that will oversee the arming and training of Ukraine's forces to support the war against Russia. The command, known as Security Assistance Group Ukraine, it will be based out of U.S. Army Europe and Africa headquarters in Wiesbaden, Germany. Its establishment was first announced on Friday, and it will be staffed by about 300 military personnel. So the command will be manned by personnel from each military branch. According to the New York Times, the leading candidate to head the mission is Army Lieutenant General Antonio Agudo Jr., and he's an Army Lieutenant General, so that's 3-star, and he currently heads the first U.S. Army headquarters at Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois. The command is expected to be up and running by early 2023, and its establishment demonstrates that the U.S. expects to be supporting the war for years to come. They wouldn't be making this command if they thought otherwise. Sabrina Singh, who is a deputy Pentagon press secretary, she told reporters on Friday that the command will, quote, ensure that we are postured to continue supporting Ukraine over the long term, end quote. And this is something that Lloyd Austin and all the other Pentagon officials keep saying, that we're doing this for the long term, for the long haul. While the U.S. is training Ukrainian soldiers in Europe, because that's what's going to be going on here, and they have already been training Ukrainian soldiers in Germany and other undisclosed locations in Europe. There is also, we know now that there's a small military presence on the ground in Ukraine that has been confirmed by the U.S. The Pentagon recently announced that U.S. military personnel based at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev have recently begun on-site inspections of U.S.-provided weapons inside Ukraine, or at least that's what they say they're doing. And besides the presence of weapons inspectors, The Intercept recently reported that U.S. Special Operations Forces and CIA personnel are also on the ground in Ukraine, but those covert operations have not been officially confirmed. And the New York Times has also reported that there's CIA on the ground, which isn't a surprise. The news when they reported that was that they were telling us. It's we all kind of figured that there was CIA on the ground, but then the Intercept said Special Operations Forces, so that is different. But we don't know what they're doing. I mean, even the Intercept report didn't say give us any idea of what the Special Operations Forces are doing. All right, the next one here is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. India pledges to buy more Russian oil as the West seeks to isolate Moscow. So India and Russia had some more. They're increasing ties. The foreign minister of India says that India has no plans to stop importing Russian energy. And this statement was made as Western countries plan to roll out price caps on Moscow's oil exports next month. So India's foreign minister traveled to Russia to meet with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, on Tuesday. And at a joint press conference, the Indian diplomat stressed the importance of the New Delhi-Moscow relationship. Since Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine in February, Washington has led a sanctions campaign aimed at crushing the Russian economy. However, so far, the economic war has largely backfired. Rising energy prices in much of the West have led to protests in Europe against the sanctions. And meanwhile, the Russian economy has weathered the Western isolation by selling more oil to China, India, and Turkey as well. Prior to the war, New Delhi imported 2% of its oil from Moscow. And in September, India received 23% of its oil from Russia. So that shows you that's a pretty major increase there. And the U.S. was trying to put pressure on India, but it hasn't seemed to work out. And they also want India. India is an interesting one because they're kind of playing both sides. The U.S. wants to use them as a counter to China, and India is on board with that to an extent, but not totally. So now they have this price cap that they're trying to implement. The G7, Janet Yellen, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, they say that they're doing this price cap. I don't know how they can possibly even think that, because it requires cooperation from Russia as well as India and China, the countries that are buying all this Russian oil. And the Indian foreign minister indicated that they will not institute the price cap and will continue buying Russian oil. So it seems like they're not going to mess around, with this relationship with Russia by buying the oil at a price set by the U.S., set by the West. But December 5th, I believe, is the date that they're trying to. Yeah, December 5th. They still haven't set a final value on the oil price cap. But if Russia reacts by cutting oil production, I mean, they can really do some damage to the global oil market, and it could be really bad for us. I mean, that we would really feel it with gas prices if oil prices really shot up. All right, the next one here. We left up a few things from yesterday. It was another sort of slow day just because of the election stuff. Um, but the next one, Chinese warplane activity near Taiwan hits a 3-month high as a British minister visits the island. So this is according to data compiled by Bloomberg of the Chinese military uh, warplane activity around Taiwan. Taiwan's defense ministry said on Monday that 62 of China's military aircraft were detected in what they called the surrounding region, and 32 of them crossed the median line or flew within the southwest corner of Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, which an ADIZ is the abbreviation. So Taiwan's defense ministry reported this on Monday. And according to Bloomberg, this is the biggest spike in Chinese warplanes around the island since the beginning of August when Nancy Pelosi visited the island. And just a little clarification of what an air defense identification zone is. In ADIZ, it's an area where a country requires foreign aircraft to identify itself. And it's not the concept is not covered under any treaties. It has no international regulations or definitions. And while China's flights into Taiwan's ADIZ have been really hyped up by Taiwan and the Western media over the past few years, before pretty recently, they were typically not close to the island, the Chinese flights. They would usually enter the southwest corner of the ADIZ, which is pretty far from Taiwan. It's closer to mainland China, but it made a catchy headline. And so they really got hyped up. And if you're watching the video and you see this big square around the island, that's Taiwan's air defense identification zone. If you noticed, it extends over mainland China. Now, Taiwan's defense ministry only reports incursions. Shouldn't call it incursions, but Chinese flights through the ADIZ that that are on the other side of this line, of the median line that separates the Taiwan Strait. You know, they're not reporting the ones over the mainland, obviously, but just to show you what the ADIZ is. And the U.S. established these ADIZs in the 1950s, I believe, over Taiwan, Japan, Korea, South Korea, and also the Philippines, I think. So these are all just U.S. It's a U.S. creation. But again, so for a while, it wasn't really that big of a deal. It was being made a big deal. But since Pelosi visited, China has really stepped up its flights closer to Taiwan by crossing that median line. Now, that's another line that was drawn by the U.S. in the 1950s. And it's an informal barrier that separates the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. But for decades, China didn't cross it. But now they do it regularly, thanks to Nancy Pelosi. So in response to her visiting, China launched its largest ever military exercises around Taiwan and began flying warplanes across the median line regularly. So Pelosi arrived in Taiwan on August 2nd, and according to Bloomberg's data, Monday's flights marked the most Chinese warplane activity around the island since August 5th, which is when they launched those major exercises. And this spike coincided with the arrival of British Trade Policy Minister Greg Hands to Taipei. He arrived on Monday, and he's holding talks with senior Taiwanese officials. And his visit to Taiwan, it came not long after Rishi Sunak was sworn in as Britain's prime minister after Liz Truss stepped down. And when he was running against Truss back in July, which he lost, but then she had to step down, and now he's in. But when he was running, he vowed he said he was going to take a hard line on China, and like many U.S. officials, the U.S. is saying China is the top threat. Sunak also described Beijing as the biggest long-term threat to Britain. And the spike in Chinese flights, another thing that happened on Monday, Lithuania opened a trade office in Taiwan. And these are the things that these flights are a reaction to. They're a reaction to other foreign governments increasing ties with Taiwan or visiting Taiwan, because China considers Taiwan to be its own territory. It's against formal ties between the island and other governments. And on Tuesday, which I have another story on this that'll go over, the U.S. launched formal trade talks with Taiwan. those were scheduled, so it could have also been a reaction to that. Um, but this uptick in Chinese flights, and these numbers, I've gone over these numbers before. I hope I'm not too redundant, but I think it's really good to drive home the point that it's very clear China's military activity is a response to what what they consider provocations, Western intervention in Taiwan. According to numbers compiled by Japan Times, China flew 302 sorties across the median line in August. So that's after Pelosi visited in 1 month. Between 1954 and August 2020, China flew across the barrier only 4 times. 4 times in all those decades. And then that increased a little bit between September 2020 and when Pelosi visited in August 2022. It happened 23 times between those almost 2 years. And that little uptick after September 2020, it came because the Trump administration sent the highest level cabinet officials to Taiwan since Washington severed diplomatic relations with Taipei in 1979. So again, that's when we saw more Chinese flights in the ADIZ. That's when Taiwan began reporting them. It was a response to high-level U.S. officials visiting Taiwan. All right. The next one here, the U.S. and Taiwan begin trade talks despite objection from China. So the U.S. and Taiwan kicked off 2 days of talks in New York on Tuesday aimed at reaching a new pact to deepen trade and economic cooperation despite strong objections from Beijing. The initiative was first agreed on back in June, and then the planned talks were announced in August. They are expected to focus on agriculture, digital trade, and removing barriers to trade between Taiwan and the US. So, again, the US has not had formal relations with Taiwan since it severed them in 1979, and that was part of the deal to normalize with Beijing. China is against official contacts between Washington and Taipei and has made its objections to the trade talks known. So a Chinese embassy spokesman said on Tuesday, quote, China is always against any country negotiating economic and trade agreements of sovereign implication or official nature with China's Taiwan region. We urge the U.S. not to repeat its wrongdoing, end quote. So the U.S. delegation, these talks are being done under the auspice of the U.S.'s de facto embassy in Taiwan, which is the American Institute in Taiwan, and Taiwan's de facto embassy in the U.S. So, but it's being led by Terry McCartan, and he is the assistant to the U.S. trade representative. So he's a pretty high-level U.S. official who's leading these talks. And these talks follow a pattern of the U.S. increasing its ties with Taiwan as part of its effort to counter China. And this has really changed in the past few years. The U.S. didn't do this stuff before very recently. And Congress is looking to significantly boost military support for the island. They're looking to give them billions in military aid. We'll find out soon what that final number is going to be. Right now, it's $10 billion, but it could change as the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the military spending bill for 2023, is going to be negotiated between the House and the Senate. And then we'll see what the final version is that goes to Biden's desk. And China has recently reaffirmed its position that it prefers peaceful reunification with Taiwan, but it won't rule out the use of force. Foreign involvement in Taiwan is a sensitive issue for Beijing, as I was just discussing. And Chinese officials have made clear, they've said it outright, that more U.S. support for Taiwan could lead to war in the region. And I think their actions show that too. And the reason why I keep hammering this point, and I try to cover this a lot, is because just like the stuff with Ukraine, all people warning us for years that NATO expansion and everything is going to lead to something like a war. Now they get ignored and they try to erase that history as the war is going on. And similar thing is going to happen with Taiwan and China, I think, if anything ever happens. And again, I don't think an invasion is on the table, a full-scale invasion, at least anytime soon. But there's other steps China could take, like a blockade or something. And the last news story we have here is an interesting one from the Times of Israel. In a rare plea, conservative Jewry tells Netanyahu not to make Ben Gvir a minister. So this is who I was discussing him yesterday, Itamar Ben Gvir. He is part of this he is assumed to be part of the new coalition government that Netanyahu is going to form, and he wants a minister position, but he's an extremist. He's been convicted of terrorism, I believe, and that's in this letter, which comes from the official Zionist arm of the conservative movement in Israel. They issued a demand to Netanyahu, who is the presumed incoming prime minister, calling on him not to give far right politician Itamar Ben Gvir a cabinet position in light of the latter's checkered legal past and history of support for Jewish terrorism. So it's just interesting to see. I know the U.S. There's been reports that the U.S. doesn't want him to be part of the government. They're not going to want to work with the government that he's part of. But we'll see what happens here, because I think Netanyahu needs his little coalition to form a government. Um, but yeah, it's just something to keep an eye on as he's trying to form a government over there. But that's it for the news for today. We have a lot of good viewpoints as always. Again, a really good one from Ted Snyder about the slivers of hope, as he put it. And we linked to one from Caitlin Johnstone about if World War III happens, it will be the result of choices made by the U.S. empire. And she actually quotes my article about the head of Stratcom saying the other day that the head of the U.S.'s nuclear forces saying that the war in Ukraine is just a warm up for the big one that is to come. And what I think he's talking about there is China. That's going to be the big one. We have a good one from Doug Bandow at the American Conservative. Nuclear hypocrisy. Is the United States really in the position to criticize threats of nuclear war? Good spotlight from Jim Bovard about Joe Biden begging for Saudi barrels. So we just, if people aren't familiar, we have our viewpoint section, and we have a lot of original stuff. Like today, we have one from Ted Snyder, who's a regular columnist for us. But we also link to stuff from all around the web and from all different political ends of the spectrum. That's something we're proud of, is that we include voices from all over, as long as it's anti-war or non-interventionist. So it's just, you could always go check those viewpoints out. Okay, but that's it for me for today. I'll catch you tomorrow with more news. You can contact the show, news@antiwar.com. You could always support us, even though our fundraiser is over. If you go to antiwar.com/donate, you could set up a monthly recurring donation. You could buy t-shirts and hats and things like that at the link in the description. But that's it. I will talk to you tomorrow. Thanks for listening.